Columbus is not someone that we should celebrate because he spread oppression and he spread genocide throughout the indigenous people who inhabited the land before. This land was not barren. This land belonged to a group of people, and it's wrong to celebrate someone who tried to annihilate those people.
It's unfortunate, but people look at what's politically correct and what seems good in today's world, and are not mindful of the big picture.
Think of the other iconic American heroes that we celebrate, and everybody uses the example of, Washington owned slaves, and Lincoln was not necessarily the great emancipator outside of the circumstances of his time. These are all real issues, but we don't tear them down. We engage them, and we're running the risk of tearing down something that says a lot about the core values of our country.
If we're not going to teach the truth about Columbus, then I don't think we should teach about Columbus at all. Let's teach math, let's teach chemistry. Let's teach something else. It's all well and good to say, well, the kids grow up stupid. At least they'll know they're stupid. At least they'll know that they never had a course in American history.
In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He had 3 ships and left from Spain. He sailed through sunshine, wind, and rain. He sailed by night, he sailed by day. He used the stars to find his way. A compass also helped him know how to find the way to go. 90 sailors were on board. Some men worked while others snored. Then the workers went to sleep, and others watched the ocean deep. Day after day they looked for land. They dreamed of trees and rocks and sand. October 12th, their dream came true. We never saw Indians,
One of the first things I do with my students is I come into class and I say, I want everybody to watch very carefully. And then I go up to a girl, and I've arranged it with her beforehand, but nobody else knows that. And I scoop up her purse off her desk, and I say, this is my purse. And the kids look at me like, no, it's not. And I say, oh, yeah, it is. And I say, I can prove it to you. And then I open it, and oh my God, kids are really outraged that I would pry into it. I say, what's your problem? This is my purse. This is my brush, I'll say, okay, if you don't think it is, then prove it to me. Why is this not mine? We saw you take it. That's Nikki's stuff in there. If, we could give you a test and you wouldn't know what's in there as well as Nikki would know. I say, okay. Let's say I discovered Nikki's purse. Now it's mine, isn't it? Wait a second. Just because you call it something different doesn't mean that that's your purse now. No. I say, well, what else could we call it? What else did I? Well, you stole Nikki's purse. You ripped it off. You jacked her purse, or all these things. And so we begin looking at language, and what is it called when somebody goes into somebody else's land militarily? Well, it's an invasion. So instead of saying that Columbus discovered America, we could say he invaded America. We could say all these things that you said about the purse, that I ripped it off, that I jacked it. We could say all those kind of things too. And so whose perspective are we taking when we call it a discovery? Well, it's a perspective of the so-called discoverers.
What did this person do actually when he arrived, and why do we have a holiday named after him? That's the good stuff of history, because again, that's the critique. That's where we get into the realm of interpretation, how we judge somebody in retrospect. To me, a mythical hero is somebody that is above critique, somebody who is essentially a deity, somebody who cannot and should not be questioned because they're God. And I think that becomes hugely problematic. Obviously, history is littered with all kinds of heroes and villains, but they were all human beings. None of them were deities, and none of them are or should be above critique.
He's a cultural icon, a messenger of Christ, a genocidal conqueror, and a patriotic hero. He's a parade, he's a protest. He's an opportunity to get that dining room set you've wanted for 15% off. He never stepped foot in any of our 50 United States, a nation that, when he died, was still 270 years away from being formed. But take a look around. He's everywhere in a land he never knew existed. Yet, in places where he did land, he hasn't exactly been popular. Christopher Columbus is responsible for one of the most monumental events in all of human history. For a person so prevalent in our society, so ingrained in our national heritage, why do so many of us learn hardly anything at all in school beyond a rhyme and the names of his 3 ships?
Really, to tell the true history of the United States of America, you have to start with the indigenous people, and you have to tell the story of what happened to us and how it happened to us and why. And it didn't just start with Christopher Columbus. That's only one aspect of the atrocities that happened. And so that's the beginning, though. If you're going to start it with a rhyme and it's great and it's wonderful, then you're already starting off with a lie.
Every year, the second Monday in October is more than just a day or a name on the calendar. It's a microcosm of the continuing clash between the old world and the new. Imperialism, colonialism, patriotism, racism, religion, greed, human rights, environmentalism, and education all take center stage around one of the most useful and enduring symbols in American history: a sailor from 15th century Genoa.
Remember that Europe, particularly Spain, was coming out of an 800-year war, and a lot of their natural resources and economic resources were depleted, which is when Columbus left. That same day, they were expelling Jews and the last of the Muslims out from those Spanish areas and taking over their businesses, right? And to get the money back into the coffers of the leaders of that. So Columbus was really, that voyage was really about that, building some kind of economic pipeline that would send resources and help build up the Spanish Empire, which it did.
There was, among the Christian population of Spain, there was this enthusiasm, thinking that the Christians finally would be able to even reconquer Jerusalem. The fact that Jerusalem was still under the rule of the Muslims, of the Ottomans, to be precise, was a real, like a thorn on the side of European Christians. And that's probably one of the reasons why the Spanish monarchs, especially Queen Isabella, were willing to support Columbus's undertaking, even though many experts at the Castilian court thought that Columbus's project was kind of ill-advised and that Columbus didn't really know what he was talking about.
Growing up, we learn about his triumphant landing after his first voyage at sea. It's a story about courage and perseverance. But his other 3 voyages are treated as footnotes, and what happened on land gets even less attention.
The first building that Columbus built on Hispaniola was a fort. Now this is symbolic to me of the culture that Columbus was bringing here. He didn't build a church.
Well, with my own students now, if I ask them, who discovered America? Who do they say discovered America? Everybody, Columbus. And in fact, a lot of kids will even start in 1492, and so they all know that little ditty together. Of course, if I ask them, well, who was here? Who did he encounter when he came? Who did he discover? And kids will say, well, the Indians. And I'll say, well, okay, but what particular nationality? What name? Can you name any of the people who are here? No, none. And I say, well, what does that tell us? What does that tell us? That everybody knows the name of Columbus, but nobody knows the names of the people who were here.
Taino culture was really based on need, not greed.
For many centuries, the Taino people lived throughout the Caribbean islands. They were a peaceful and deeply spiritual people who felt blessed by a female creator. Everything they were thankful for was strongly connected to the reciprocity of nature. Communities throughout the islands lived in good health, sustainably harvesting both the land and the sea. They had no need for armies or police. They would settle differences not by going to battle, but by playing a game. Nothing like the wars or diseases that were busy ravaging Europe existed here. They loved getting together to create art, have feasts, and play music. The Tainos were remarkably friendly and generous, and they always seemed to be smiling. The word Taino meant good people, and by all accounts, they were.
He even said himself in his journals, they're the most peaceful, loving people, and they would give you anything, and they had no animosity, they had no reason for war.
If you look at his diaries, he right away, he's looking at the people and at the resources and really tabulating economically how much all of these folks would be worth. And he says right out in the beginning, with 50 men, I could subjugate these people and they could be, great servants. So that's a clear intent of what he had in mind. He's just monetarizing everything right in the beginning. He had to pay back Spain for the boats and the men and the supplies. So there's a clear commodification of resources happening, not only the natural resources, but of the human resources.
He used the Doctrine of Discovery, being able to claim lands for your crown and claim them for another country because the people were less than.
In 1455, the Pope ordered the King of Portugal to go out into the world and to vanquish all people of color, to capture all their possessions, to take all of their lands. This edict by the Pope came to be known as the Doctrine of Discovery. It is this order by the Pope that caused Columbus to come and to destroy our peoples.
The way they viewed the native peoples, the Taino people, in those early interactions was just, the epitome of racism, right? Racism meaning the dictionary definition, meaning that they saw themselves as superior.
If you have this doctrine of discovery, both in a symbolic sense, but also in the historical and literal sense, that justifies the actions that you take against the people who were already there, and that also justifies the silences that you create, right? So that justifies you not talking about them, you not acknowledging them, because how can people be on a land if you've discovered it, if you're the first person to find it, right? That's not possible.
In the course of their hunt for gold, the Spanish let no atrocity go untested.
He comes back to Haiti with 17 ships, with between 1,000 and 2,000 soldiers, with attack dogs, with armored horses, and with cannons.
They read out what a speech before they got into towns. These were people under his watch. The speech that says, And sometimes the people could be sleeping, they didn't understand Spanish, they would just read this out and say, you're now under the control of Spain, and if you try to fight against me, we will wipe you out. The condition was clear, they said it.
He's the first conquistador, if you will. And in fact, he invented many of the really bad habits by which conquistadors have been notoriously known ever since.
The rapes and the murders and the selling little girls into prostitution, I mean, that's common knowledge. That ain't us trying to bring out some kind of revisionist history. That's documented from his own journals, right?
He sent his people out to find all the gold that he knew was there. And when they couldn't find it, if they were to enslave or kill the Taino people, that was all right by him. What he wanted to do is make sure that they were hunting for gold.
He enslaved people here in the Western Hemisphere and sent them back to the Eastern Hemisphere in chains. About 5,000 in all, to the Canary Islands and to Spain.
It's the reason why the great historian of Africa, Basil Davidson, calls Christopher Columbus the father of the slave trade.
They would use some folks if they got mad at them, or if it was just, a bad day for them, they would use folks for target practice or just to see how sharp their swords were.
One of the things that gets left out is the horrific nature of the tribute system that Columbus initiated, where people's hands were chopped off if they didn't deliver these little hawk's bells of gold every 3 months.
They engaged in all manner of sexual exploitation, not only of women, but we're talking about children. And these are accounts by their own people. This is not something that we make up. Many people in various Taino communities just outright committed suicide, mass suicides, because of this hell on earth that they were living. When they were making examples of folks, remember that these were guys who really fine-tuned the Inquisition, right? That attacks against anybody who was non-Christian, right? The burning of heretics, etc. So what they would do to the Tainos is that, to make examples of them, they would hang them 13 at a time. That would emulate the apostles and Christ, right? So 12 apostles and Christ, that's how they would say they were making this sacrifice, or however they would term this horrific act, as something that was supposed to be exalting Christianity.
He saw himself as Christophorens, that is to say, Christopher, the Christ bearer, and that he was bringing Christ and Christianity to the heathen people of this world that he had discovered.
Is anything that they did at that time something Jesus would have done? I don't think so. Their whole system in Europe was based on the exploitation of the resources and natural resources in the New World, slave labor, right? All these things helped build up Europe to the power that is now. Look, Europe today, the European monetary is higher than U.S. monetary, right? That system started, right? It was a result of all of that exploitation. After the Caribbean, then the English did it. The French did it. They just followed that same suit, that same pattern. All of that stems from that period. Columbus was the chief architect of that.
My dad came to this country as a teenager with his family, and they were successful because they worked hard, they had integrity, they believed in family, they believed in God, and they believed in the country that they came to.
We were a community of people that relied foremost on family and church for their social structure, not on a civic society. It was not something that we had a tradition of in southern Italy, and that was, I think, suspect. Perhaps we were seen as a community that didn't want to assimilate and was sort of maintaining its own structures and values, and it was just simple things. We're very different. You know, our Catholicism, our ethnic makeup, our look. We were clearly outsiders.
The Italians who came over in the 19th century, and who were in many cases shunned aside by much of white American society, the Italians clung to Columbus as an Italian. They thought that would be a way for them to establish themselves as a cultured, heroic people from the old world.
It was, in the minds of most white Protestants, a white Protestant nation. Not everyone here was a white Protestant, that's for sure. But in their minds, white Protestants were the true and just rulers of the land.
I certainly don't think Italian Americans came with this vision of Columbus as a hero. Columbus is a figure that was really almost more of an American narrative, an American mythology, than one that came with our people in their mass migration.
The American society, American polity, has used Columbus, since we were a nation, in fact, as the symbol of America, as if Columbus had ever gotten to the United States, as if Columbus knew anything at all about North America other than the islands. We just kind of grabbed him.
Here was a man who bravely sailed across the Atlantic to an unknown land, forged onward through hostile conditions, and tamed savage heathen Indians who needed European salvation. He triumphed because of his faith in God, only in the end to be unappreciated by his monarchy. Reduced to that simple narrative, Columbus was practically John Adams.
In the early republic, one of the ways that you celebrated Columbus was by completely obliterating his Catholicism and his Italianness, right? Just making him a kind of free-floating signifier, as we would say, just some white guy who came here first, claimed this for us.
They certainly weren't going to take Tecumseh or Crazy Horse or somebody like that as a national hero. They could contrive Columbus to be a heroic figure because they didn't know very much about him. Nobody else was resurrecting him. You might have thought that Spain would claim him as a hero, or perhaps even Italy.
People in those days thought it was amazing if you took a word and made it sound Latin. It immediately gave something a sense of grandiosity and elegance. In the lead-up to the Revolution, the American colonies wanted to identify themselves as something different, something independent. Even the word America was too British. Columbus became Columbia, the poetic nickname of colonial America. And long before France gave us this one, Columbia was our first female symbol of liberty. Hail Columbia was one of our earliest unofficial national anthems, and played proudly as George Washington galloped to his first inauguration.
At that same time, a capital was being built, which was to be called Washington District of Columbia. And Columbia became the symbol of the United States from then on.
Now that Columbus was one of them, patriotic Protestants wanted to commemorate the 300th anniversary of his discovery of their land. The Tammany Society or Columbian Order in New York, notoriously known today as Tammany Hall, made headlines for their celebrations. Boston, another city of influential Protestants, soon followed. And in Baltimore, 1,500 miles away from where he landed, the oldest Columbus monument in the entire world was built in his honor. Before long, authors and poets started rediscovering the man who originally inspired Columbia. But as he was reshaped back into the human form of Christopher Columbus, he retained a mythical essence. The future legacy of Columbus in America was put into motion. As manifest destiny shaped the American spirit of westward expansion, this founding father of a new world went along for the ride.
White settlers, Euro-Americans, felt themselves to be on the high, sort of in a higher order of the human race.
Andrew Jackson made a career of subjugating Native Americans, as a militia leader, U.S. general, and ultimately as a very popular president.
The war in 1814, the War of 1812, he takes an increasingly hostile attitude toward native rights and the existence of native nations, and his treaties with the Creeks and other tribes in the South after the War of 1812 were very, very punitive. I mean, we're talking about taking away thousands and thousands of acres of tribal land, and he even acts in a hostile way with tribes that fought alongside him during the War of 1812, so the Choctaws, for example. He is the person, I think, that takes Jefferson's idea of taking native land and making sure that native people are not in contact with American settlers. He's the one who really is ultimately the architect of Indian removal. He thinks that native people are going to become extinct because the conflict between civilized Americans and savage native people is going to always devolve to the interests of superior white people.
It was the age of the common man, and by the end of Jackson's 2 terms as president, Indian removal, slavery, and the exploitation of nature in the United States had flourished as a joint venture. And the common man loved Christopher Columbus. Washington Irving was a successful fiction writer, best known as the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. In 1826, he was offered a chance to write a biography of Columbus based on new documents uncovered in Spain.
It was extremely successful, and it was extremely fictional.
His fiction would be taught as fact for generations, including one especially erroneous detail that lingers on to this day.
A person wrote to the local paper just the other week saying that we can't trust scientists because they didn't know that the Earth was round, and Columbus had to prove it to them.
This whole flat Earth myth kind of converts him into a man of science, if you think about it. I mean, he proved it. Nobody else knew it. The Greeks knew it. People, when you see an eclipse of the moon, the Earth casts a round shadow on the moon.
Of all the distortions about Columbus, probably the most elemental one is this guy was like this tribune of modernity. And everyone wants him to be that, right? The pro-Columbus people do. He ushered in modernity. And the anti-Columbus people do too, because they think that parts of modernity were a disaster, right? But it turns out that in many ways he wasn't. He was much closer to a medievalist, He just had all these pre-Enlightenment ideas about the nature of knowledge and the nature of humanity, which is what you would kind of expect if you looked at the timeline.
Our Capitol building was getting an upgraded dome. The new plans for renovation called for him to be just about everywhere as a distinguished symbol of our national character. This giant sculpture of him holding the world in his hand beside a cowering indigenous woman stood next to many presidential inaugurations until the 1950s. The massive bronze doors that are the entrance of the Capitol, all him, from top to bottom. In the rotunda, where 11 presidents have lain in state, the painting of his first landfall isn't far from John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence. And right next to that is Ronald Reagan. His face is one of the handful of stone reliefs on the rotunda wall. And higher up, he can be seen again landing in the New World as part of the 360-degree narrative of our nation. He's in the President's room as part of a ceiling fresco. And in the Senate chamber, you can see this. As his legend grew, so did his place in American history. By the mid-19th century, he could be found on the first page of Chapter 1 in children's history books. The first name many children would see and identify with the United States.
We landed in Lock Haven in the year of 73. A minister of the gospel one evening said to me, Are you the party of lumbermen that once agreed to go and spend a winter pleasantly on Colley's Run, I-ho? Oh yes, we'll go to Colley's Run, to that we will agree, provided you pay good wages, our passage to and fro. Then we'll agree to accompany you to Colley's Run, I-ho. Then we'll agree to accompany you to Colley's Run, I-ho.
Gold rushes and other forms of exploiting nature continued to accompany Indian removal. More land was seized and parceled to railroad companies, which fueled the explosion of America's industrial economy.
I think we forget how violent the American labor movement was. During those years, the U.S. Army was called out over 100 times to crush labor action. And that was the environment that Columbus Day came from. And it's the Catholic working class finding a Columbus that will be a kind of lion for them.
In New Haven, Connecticut, Father Michael McGivney saw families in his parish being struck by workplace tragedy. Societies that already existed which provided safety nets for their communities were mostly Protestant.
It's funny because in the 20th century, obviously communism was the big international threat, and we forget that there was another international threat in the 19th century, which was in some ways much scarier to Americans, which was the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church, like communism, is an explicitly international organization. Please be clear, I'm not saying it's communist, right? And many of those people would be appalled at that idea, right? But it was and remains an international organization, and therefore it raises the specter of divided loyalties. What are you really, right? And who do you listen to? Who are you beholden to? Are you really one of us, right? Or do you actually respect the rule of this foreign power, right, that isn't us? And in Baltimore, there was a huge rumor that went through town that the Pope had actually built a tunnel under the Atlantic Ocean. And the Pope was coming with these legions, with an army, to invade.
Within the Catholic Church, Columbus had already gained an exemplary reputation for his faith. And the Church enjoyed holding the discovery of the New World as one of their achievements over the heads of Protestants. Catholics were searching for their own American origin story.
Protestants already had it. It's called Plymouth Rock. All right? And the Catholics say, you know what? We're going to do you one better. We're going to do you 2 centuries better, right? Screw you, right? You think you were here first? You weren't. There was this Catholic dude that was here before. The town fathers of Boston, white Protestants, put up a statue of Leif Erikson. Why? We'll go you one better. We'll go back even further in time and find this other dude, this Protestant guy. No, wait a second, they weren't Protestants then. Okay, he wasn't Protestant. He was like some Scandinavian dude, but at least he was like from Northern Europe, and he wasn't some swarthy Italian guy, like, sailing for the Spanish crown or whatever.
Catholics and Protestants being a part of the same benefit society wasn't going to work, so Father McGivney and his parish formed their own. Just like Italians had done, who were also Catholic by and large, they used the patriotic image of Columbus to say they were just as American as anyone else.
Yes, isn't this a great place? So great that a Catholic guy discovered it, even though he didn't come to the continental U.S., and even though on and on and on. There are many even those. It's not about what he did. It's about him as a symbol. It's hard to overturn symbols like that because they do work. They do work in our lives, and they unite us.
Columbus's growing resume now included so much religious virtue that sainthood was seriously considered. The way in which this Knights of Columbus history book describes him, you would have thought Columbus had 2 of every animal aboard the Santa Maria.
In 1492, a Dago from Italy, he run round the coast of Spain, and he sell the hot tamale. He go up to the Queen of Spain, say, give me the ships and cargo. I'm a son of a bitch in 90 days, I'll bring you back Chicago. Oh, he knew the world was round, oh, that the new world could be found, oh, this dirty, stinking son of a bitch of a Christopher Colombo.
The high point of Columbus mania was in Chicago in 1893, for the 401st anniversary of his landfall. 401st because the event was so epic in scale, it wasn't ready in time. A temporary city was built from the ground up. But the fact it was late didn't really matter. Gigantic crowds poured in from around the globe. He was portrayed as buddies with Uncle Sam and George Washington. Columbia became Uncle Sam's relative. Advertisements for Columbus sales events, the ones you see every year in October, sprung up everywhere. The Pledge of Allegiance was created specifically for this event. And under his name, the past, present, and future greatness of mankind was on full display.
Simon Pokagon, who's a Potawatomi, gives an address at the World Columbian Exposition where he says, this is no celebration for Native people. This is a disaster for us because, you know, what Columbus started is still going on and it's destroyed us.
Columbus became a fixture of Americana as tribes out west starved, were forced into reservations, or massacred.
The settlers, you know, who ignored treaties and who ignored, you know, native boundaries and tribal lands, who really felt that they could just go anywhere they wanted and encroach on any territories that they wanted, that they never thought for a minute that what they were doing was illegitimate, and never thought that any response by Native people, any rebellion by Native people, any reaction by Native people was legitimate. I think they felt that they were always attacked, that Native people were savages, and there was no sympathy for them, really, on the frontier.
A proud Italian-American successfully pushed for the first official Columbus Day in Colorado in 1907. The Knights of Columbus in Tammany Hall followed with their own lobbying efforts to create more, and by the 1920s, the majority of states had adopted their own. In New York, Generoso Pope was one of the richest Italians in America. Like Columbus, he was a Catholic Italian who went west with nothing and made a name for himself. A classic example of the American dream. As an influential Democrat in Tammany Hall, he became closely associated with Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Pope's Italian newspapers and radio businesses helped FDR secure the Italian-American vote in 1933. A year after becoming president, FDR made Columbus Day an official federal holiday.
An attempt, I think, by Roosevelt to give give these people something that they could cling to in these very dark times of the Depression. And it has subsequently become a yearly holiday, although no longer on October 12th because it had to be movable so people could have long weekends. But
we have a picture of the $24 purchase of Manhattan in New York City. It's a sculpture, a bas-relief sculpture near the bottom of Manhattan where this purchase never took place. Well, it shows the Dutchman with a coat on, a heavier coat than this, and the native nearly naked. Suppose this happened in February. The native's going to be dying shortly thereafter of frostbite. Suppose this happened in August. The Dutchman's going to be dying shortly thereafter from heat exhaustion. No two people ever dress that way on the same day, on the same spot on the earth. But we do it to show primitive and civilized. And so we don't even think about the incongruity of it all. We just accept it because we accept the traditional notion of primitive and civilized. And I'm afraid that that whole notion gets started in our textbooks with the Columbus story.
Part of the celebration of American freedom, to me, should be teaching people how to arrive at their own conclusions instead of repeating what the textbook says. That's not an act of freedom. That's the act of its opposite, right? That's an act of indoctrination.
In the early 20th century, historians began to look beneath heroic myths and grand patriotic narratives and tried to explain people's behavior based on their economic and social interests.
The classic progressive history text was Charles Beard's An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, where he looked at the portfolios of these 55 white guys who signed the Constitution, and he tried to argue that they owned, or many of them owned, failed securities under the Articles of Confederation, so it was in their economic self-interest to create this more perfect union. It's neither here nor there to say if that's true or not, but it's an example of the kind of argument that the progressives were putting forth. This isn't just this kind of unfolding manifest destiny of freedom and liberty. It's much more complicated. It has to do with all kinds of diverse interests. Well, a lot of Americans didn't want to hear that.
Americans wanted to maintain the sacred story of the Founding Fathers and the Revolution. But of all the people living in American society, the most passionate defenders of the grand patriotic narrative were immigrant Americans.
What they wanted to do was to defend their particular contribution to it. And I think they actually set a template for what happened later, in the sense that the pattern that developed since the 1920s was every group gets to insert itself in the story, provided that the story stays sacred.
After World War II, the Columbus story became even more sanitized in American classrooms. And with McCarthyism in full swing, engaging students in critical thinking about our past and present was a serious risk for educators. Now that he had his own national holiday, history and social studies during the Cold War commonly reduced Columbus into a figure who was monumental, but uncontroversial. This massive event in world history became even more simplified and vague, usually taking up a single page or less. What happened to the Tainos, or who they were at all, continued to be sidestepped. Many textbooks even managed to lift him out of the conquest that he began altogether. He was reduced simply into a man with entrepreneurial spirit, tremendous courage, and great vision to reach new heights.
It's not only Columbus that we interpret in a kind of deliberately soft way, maybe a deliberately positive way. It's really all of American history. And you can see that even in some of the book titles. Some of them are titled things like The Great Republic, The Great Experiment. I have to put my hand up when I say these, or maybe over here. Land of the Free, and so help me, I think there's another one called Home of the Brave. The American Pageant. No other subject has titles like these. If you read, if you take a course in American literature even, which is American, it'll have a reader in American literature, or a reader in U.S. lit, something like that. You take a chemistry course, it's called Chemistry, or Introduction to chemistry. It's not called Triumph of the Molecules, for God's sake.
I think it's terrific that our students now learn about the multicultural dimensions of America, but I would caution against thinking that that's necessarily a progressive outcome, because the story I've told in my work highlights the conservative dimensions of all of that. Frederick Douglass is in there, right? And Nat Turner's in there, right? But, the book doesn't say, now, wait a second. If we look at Douglass's 1848 speech, can we really say that, this story is a quest for liberty? Right? That's the title of the book, right? But is it a valid title? Is that really the theme of our past? And again, there's no simple answer to that, right? I'm not saying that the title should be like Rise of Fascism, right? What I'm saying is there should be debate and contestation about what the themes are or should be.
I think American culture has a culture around discovery and around exploration. So you have, Columbus discovering America. You have Americans discovering the West and Western expansion. You have the United States going to space. So there's this American culture around continuously discovering, and I think that Columbus is that kind of push for, we have found this new world, and like kind of the celebration of us being in this new world, despite that being entirely inaccurate. So I think that's just something that's a part of U.S. culture, where people want to discover, which is just, I think, a function of kind of, in some ways, empire. Yeah.
Has U.S. expansionism ceased, or does it continue? Is it taking on new forms? Is it as overt as it was? These are questions that we have to look at, and why does Columbus link so closely with those ideals?
In 1992, a different myth emerged, and it was the word discovery was pushed aside, and people began to, well, no, Native Americans were here, we can't call it a discovery anymore. So instead, we'll call it an encounter, and we'll call it an exchange, the Columbian Exchange, so that, well, the Europeans got corn, and the Native Americans got horses. So we'll call it this exchange. So it was a different language, and it was a language that had more insight to it and more fairness in some respects, but also was a language that hid the exploitation, that hid the brutality, that hid the violence, and it gave the people who were doing textbooks an out, and they didn't have to talk about that because they could talk about corn and horses.
One of the really hard things about generalizing about American education is it's still so irreducibly local. There are 14,000 school districts, and they set most, although not all, of the policies for those school districts.
American history, even in America, can easily vary from state to state. A common example is that a classroom down south might teach that the Civil War was about states' rights. A classroom up north might say that it was really only about one of those states' rights.
There's no interest group called People for Debating the Other Side in schools. People enter this arena not because they want a full discussion of the different dimensions of an issue. It's because they want their point of view privilege.
The lines between opinions, facts, and beliefs easily get blurred. Different interpretations get passed down through generations.
We have this national celebration in which we talk about this great interracial love-in at Plymouth Colony called Thanksgiving, right? And it's full of myth and distortion and error. I don't necessarily think we need to tell the 4-year-olds that, Miles Standish cut off the head of the Wampanoag Indians. 14-year-olds, I think we should, right? But there's probably, there isn't harm in teaching the 4-year-olds the myth, provided that there's some correction later.
Yeah. And that's the correction that I don't think a lot of people really get with Columbus.
No.
And the thing is, there are adults today that still believe, and I'm going to add to that, want to believe what they were taught in elementary school about various things. Some people still want to believe that George Washington actually did cut down that cherry tree.
There's some evidence that, especially in elementary school classrooms, they just begin every year with discovery. So there's a lot of repetition that goes into that, right? We may not get, to the Vietnam War, right? But we all know about Columbus because you begin the school year and you go back to the explorers.
You've got a corporation, let's say like Pearson, that I don't know it's how many hundreds of millions of dollars in sales Pearson has, but it's huge, and it's a global transnational corporation. They have absolutely no interest in getting kids to think critically about the system that they're embedded in. And so, and they don't.
All you need is to alienate one important school board member or one member of the state textbook commission, and you're done. And the companies invest a huge amount in the development of these resources, and it strikes me as quite rational behavior on their part to try to denude the books of controversy, because the last thing you want to do is set off any alarm bells. Please understand that I'm in no way endorsing this. I'm just, like a historian, trying to explain it. It makes sense.
Franklin W. Pierce. He's my candidate for the second worst president in the history of the country. He was so bad, he's the only president who wanted to get renominated after winning election the first time, and his party wouldn't even renominate him. When he came back to his native state of New Hampshire, it is said, I think accurately, that nobody even met his train. But does any textbook say anything bad about Franklin W. Pierce? Well, no. Why not? Well, because they don't want to offend New Hampshire. They don't want to lose the sales of Concord or some other town in New Hampshire. After all, he's the only president New Hampshire ever had.
We now know that Thomas Jefferson fathered people by a slave that he owned. We don't know all the details about that, but we do know that it occurred. And in only a couple of very isolated instances does that appear in an American history textbook. That seems like a huge problem to me, because that's hugely important knowledge. What you make of that knowledge is, again, like all historical matters, open to interpretation. But you can't even engage in the act of interpretation if you don't actually face the fact.
There's a textbook that we use here in Portland, and it's called Modern World History. And there's only one class that students take in their whole high school career in Oregon dedicated to the world. And it's now called Modern World History. It's actually named after the textbook.
No textbook is going to contain everything that it needs to contain to effectively teach the curriculum.
I grew up in Colorado, and they have a specific Colorado history book that you have to go through in elementary school, and it was heavily focused on colonists and settlers in Colorado. So it was very much framed in the way of talking about mountain men, like exploring Colorado. And so I learned about Columbus in that sense where he was very much construed as a hero, and we talked about like the peaceful interactions with like Native Americans, and like it was very much like simplified to where he discovered the United States, and that was the only thing that was important of the whole event.
What's at the core of the Columbus myth, I think, is that initial encounter. And almost all the books tell it exactly the same, that Columbus comes, he plants the flag, he names it San Salvador, he claims it for the king and queen. You know, oftentimes there are kind of religious iconography, there's the cross, there's the sword, there's flags and so forth. And that's just presented unproblematically. And they do acknowledge that there were people, because they show the people, by and large, the people who are standing there kind of watching this transpire. And the problem with that is that it teaches kids that colonialism is okay. It silences any kind of critical capacities. And it doesn't nurture any kind of questioning, any kind of curiosity.
Native children shouldn't have the pressure to learn that truth on their own.
Mm-hmm.
That needs to be a collective accountability, even if it is a very difficult thing, even if it's a very hard thing to teach.
We have to be very careful when we are presenting that information to students because, again, we have to make it age appropriate. But there's a way you can do that with students so that you're not presenting falsehoods.
A reservation teacher in Arizona found that even in a brand new textbook, the same old story of Columbus is still popular enough to find its way even into Native American classrooms. After her students did their own detective work, the class wrote letters to textbook companies demanding change.
I provided a number of other texts for them, a number of different sources. They were really appalled when they found out a lot of things that Columbus had actually done. They couldn't believe that that would have happened to people who were essentially, in the group of their ancestors, even if not their direct ancestors. I saw it as, if we're not going to be thoughtful about this piece of our history, if we're going to let that be what we teach kids, then that represents the way that we're approaching what students are learning, and that represents what we value right now.
When my students would start to kind of come to consciousness around this, they had this moment of, why was I lied to? And was it that my teacher knew and was kind of protecting me from this truth? Was it that they didn't know either and they were just kind of teaching how they had been taught? But there's a real moment of this kind of sense of betrayal.
It is like very colonialistic and like very imperial the way like classrooms like teach. So for me, I didn't understand what like Columbus was, and like they just taught it to me as a way to like, it's another thing on the list to teach like students who don't know what they're learning.
We don't talk about it in a meaningful way that then elicits results. We just want to wash over, this is what happened, this is how it happened, these are the individuals that were hurt, now let's talk about this.
It's almost like you're not told the truth about the United States history until you get to college. And so then once you get to college, it's like mind-blowing, right? You're like, how did no one tell me this is the real truth? And here I am as an adult sitting here finally learning for the first time a lot of the things, the real history, and the things that, what do you mean natives didn't just give up their land and go over here to a reservation? What do you mean we actually killed them on purpose for money to get rid of them and annihilate them? And it's like all of those things, like what do you mean we actually did chemical warfare on Native Americans using smallpox blankets? It's like a constant, are you kidding me? Why is none of this taught? And the majority of people do not get to college and a university to learn the truth. And so where do you get to learn the truth?
We understand that when we thought we believed something was a certain way, and science now discovers something new, that this is really the way it is, and we didn't know that before because of new technology. We don't just say, oh, it doesn't exist. We change it. and we now change our textbooks so that our children understand the real truth. So why can't we do that through history?
I don't think that it's a conscious dismissal of the ills of any of these figures, but you've only got so much intellectual bandwidth, you've only got so much curriculum, you've only got so much time to converse, so everything is a reduction. And I think that, honestly, to me, the idea that we reduce people to their strengths as history stretches further and further, I think there's some value to that.
Columbus Day is a symbol of discovery, a symbol of success, a symbol of courage, a symbol of someone who had the courage to find a new land. And those are qualities that all Americans look at. We want to demonstrate to young people what the true meaning of being an Italian American is. And that is basically having integrity, hard work, belief in their family values, belief in God, and this great country that we live in.
It's supposed to be about everyone joining the parade, and no matter what group you are, understanding that this experiment in human civilization, which is an experiment like no other, it all started with 3 boats. And good came from that, and bad came from that. But here we are, and we keep coming here, and people keep coming here, because it is something special that was born out of those 3 boats and that risk that this explorer took.
It's a family day. It's truly a family day. And we hope that inspires Americans in general across this great country to believe in family, to believe in the values that we believe in, because we believe they're excellent values, they're true values, they're values that everyone should live by, not only Italian Americans, but everyone. And so that's what we try to demonstrate, that's what we try to portray, and it's authentic, it's real, and I say, God bless Italy and God bless the United States of America.
This system is premised on the erasure and death of Native people. Period. That is not a debate. All you people that live in cities and off reservation, you are defying colonial borders. You are not less Indian. You are not less human. In fact, you are more indigenous, and you're resisting because you're here. You're resisting.
Native people in this city are marginalized, and we don't have any visibility or representation in the city politics. And so we recognize the symbolic change doesn't change the material conditions people face in their lives, but we realize that this is going to open some new avenues, and it's a progressive step forward. Anytime you attempt to humanize Native people, it's a step in the right direction.
This day means a lot to me just because of the way I came to see it and be involved. I remember my mom, when she was in college, she wrote an essay, and the topic was, what's one thing you want to see gone in your lifetime? And she said she wanted to see Columbus Day abolished, and it was funny because that was kind of like a far-fetched concept when she wrote it.
As First Peoples, we've been minimized for so many years. We get an opportunity to reclaim some of our natural resources, our human rights, and so it's about our survival. As First Peoples, we have to survive, like many other diverse nations throughout this country.
We've always been here. Yeah, that's why you got the petroglyphs, you got the cavemen, and that's all native. We've always been here in America.
We call on the United States government to bring into question the validity, the legality of the Doctrine of Discovery. We want the church. We need the church to revoke this Doctrine of Discovery, to reject it, to retract it, to trash it, because this is what has caused the damage and the harm and the trauma and the destruction of our ways of life.
When Seattle passed Indigenous Peoples Day, it was such an awakening moment where anyone of Indigenous culture gets to celebrate their history and their culture and where they've come from.
It's kind of like bringing out our voice, which is historically, and even a lot of times to this day, the Native voice is it's non-existent. To us, it wasn't just that resolution ain't the end-all be-all, right? It's just simply it's a political statement. Obviously, we can celebrate being Indigenous, we can celebrate being Native each and every day, and we do. I see the Indigenous Peoples Day resolution as a catalyst to opening up further conversations on various issues. So not just historical wrongs and how these historical wrongs and colonization impacts us, but how colonization continues to impact us today.
As holidays come up and as issues come up, people are starting to say, hey guys, here's the real truth. Here's what really happened. Do you know that's what this is really about? And it's making people more consciously aware and saying, oh, I didn't know. But now I can learn more and I can change the way I've been doing this my whole life. And it's okay. It's not a shame on you, but it's almost a shame on our education system for continuing to teach the false truths of this country.
We put in there very specifically that we wanted the Seattle City Council to go to the Seattle School Board and say, you guys need to refine your education, because the misinformation about Columbus, that's where it's starting. You guys are the ones doing it. Columbus is one of the first things many students are going to learn about.
Native peoples aren't their oppression, they're not their pain. That who we are is always going to be more than that. We had organized a die-in that was 52 minutes and 30 seconds to represent the 523 years of occupation of this land, but also the resilience of Native peoples here. Unfortunately, we had an op-ed within the Brown Daily Herald, which is our campus's newspaper, basically stating that Native students should feel grateful for Columbus, and posited this theory of like the Columbian Exchange, which is that basically everyone benefited from Columbus. And for us as Native students on campus, it just seemed wildly inaccurate. When we saw Phoebe and I, that's when I said, well, we need to show what the actual truth is in terms of the lie in the idea of the Columbian Exchange, especially in the legacy of what genocide really means for Indigenous peoples in the United States.
A wave of cities, states, and colleges throughout the U.S. are abandoning Columbus Day. Grassroots activism led by American Indian groups in the 60s and 70s had grown by the time of Columbus's 500th anniversary. 1992 was the first centenary celebration that was met with organized resistance, and the first Indigenous Peoples Day was created at UC Berkeley. Driving the movement today are people who grew up during that time period. But what makes them significant is they are far more socially connected and were raised on instant access to information. They haven't been confined to a textbook or a classroom.
There's this big talk about Indigenous Peoples Day. And we totally agree with there should be an Indigenous Peoples Day, but it need not take away Columbus Day and supplant it with Indigenous Peoples Day. I think that there should be an Indigenous Peoples Day, and I think it should be established, and it should be celebrated. And we as Italian Americans, will celebrate with those people for that holiday. And we hope that they look towards us as Italian Americans and celebrate with us our heritage and culture.
When the truth comes out, do you really want to claim that as your heritage? You know, there's how many people are still suffering in Germany because of the Nazis, and that's a part of history they don't cover up, and they tell the truth about. They still have the camps and all of the different things that happen, but they still proud to be German. And so it's owning your history and owning it correctly and honestly.
We had one person who was helping us during in getting a lot of this passed and a lot of this moving forward, Cameron Johnson, who said during one meeting, I think it's like an egregious insult to Italian Americans to say that like their best hero that they can come up with is Christopher Columbus. And I really like that. I think that that's a really good way of putting it.
What I have had is questions by the press in reference to Indigenous Peoples Day versus Columbus Day, and some of the activities that Columbus engaged in when he was here. Some people want to judge Christopher Columbus by today's standards, which unfortunately is not fair and not possible, because if we were to do that, we'd go back in history and look at the leaders of the United States who became presidents. And unfortunately, there were things that they did that would not be approved of today.
If the argument that Christopher Columbus was a man of his time, then we're Native women of this time, and that is something that needs to be held accountable to now. That like this is just as valid, if not more so, than Columbus being a man of his time.
There are certain actions, such as slavery, that I think could be regarded as sinful at any time when they're practiced.
The Dominicans, as soon as they came to the Americas, the first Antonio de Montesinos is preaching against what's happening to the Tainos from the beginning. He's telling Columbus's son Diego, the admiral, that he says, you can't go to heaven. You can't be a Christian and treat people this way. Those are people of their time as well. The Tainos were resisting from the very beginning. They were men of their times and women of their times.
There was an outcry in Spain by members of the church and others who were saying, what's going on there is not right. These people are human beings. Bartolome De Las Casas was one of those folks who spoke out, and he went there as a colonizer in the beginning. But when he saw these atrocities, he converted right into somebody who became the first bishop ordained in the New World.
He was an individual who belonged to a world in which there was only one true religion, which was Christianity. And of course, Las Casas thought that his obligation and his mission in life was to convert the indigenous peoples of the New World to Christianity. However, he will argue always that you couldn't. The obligation was to convert the Indians of the New World to Christianity, but you couldn't use force to convert them. They had to convert willingly or voluntarily.
He has one black mark on his record, and it is literally a black mark. At one point, he advocated for African slavery to replace American Indian slavery, but he then took that back and took it back with a vengeance and asked for, and begged God's pardon and humanity's pardon for ever suggesting it. And he's from Columbus's time, so if he knew better, why couldn't Columbus?
Why haven't people learned more about Columbus? Well, the Columbus Day celebration had a very particular purpose and resonance.
I know from my experience in the community, many younger Italian Americans are more than willing to re-examine Columbus as a national hero, more than willing to re-examine a holiday without him. What everyone can agree on in our community, from young to old, left to right and center, is we're not open to discussing the erasing of a day to celebrate Italian American pride. So for me, my first task is preserving the day on the calendar that celebrates the accomplishments of 25 million very patriotic Americans who've done a lot in this country and continue to do a lot in this country, and I refuse to see that lost without a fight.
The Indians, when they were here, I don't want to judge them, but I'm sure they had their times when they did things that were not appropriate to what we would look at today, in killing and massacre and so forth. But that was then, and you can't negate all the good things that Indians have done for this country over the years, just the way you can't negate all the good things that Italian Americans have done.
They want to cling to that tradition, and I can understand that. But I would say the way to regard this is saying, when we talk about Columbus Day, we have to understand that we do so because it was a very important event.
I think the problem is information is so much more available than it's ever been, that sensitivities have to be higher. People have the opportunity to learn so much more than they ever learned before about our history, about topics, about what goes on in the world and other societies. So I think there's a reason that we're overly politically sensitive and politically correct, but we certainly are.
What does an incomplete picture give us? An incomplete picture gives us only a part of the truth, and it dismisses the fact that critical thinking should be involved in making a sound decision. Do we want the whole history, or do we just want the history that makes us feel good? So if we're teaching our students that, if we're teaching our children that, then we just continue to perpetuate generations going forward that don't have all the facts. And sometimes you have just enough information to be dangerous.
We're going to keep going back, and eventually we're going to find human nature as the root cause of all of our good and all of our bad.
When you look at what he really did, and you look at the real history of how many people were murdered, how many people suffered during those times, we don't celebrate a Hitler Day. And would it be the same? And so why celebrate somebody that that murdered many people? And it wouldn't matter what people it was, they were humans. And so I don't see why we would celebrate somebody that did that.
I would say that I would continue to support Columbus Day if it provided an occasion for the kind of discussion that you and I are talking about. And it's an opportunity to discuss the nature of exploration, the nature of discovery, the nature of conquest, all right? The nature of exploitation. These are all part of the story. The nature of race itself. If the point is simply to wave the flag, either the American or the Italian flag, I don't see a reason to do that. We do that on the other days.
If we look at it in the same way that we look at other controversial issues around symbolism, we could probably make a link with the controversy that surrounds the Confederate flag. Why is the Confederate flag under so much, why is there tension when we talk about it? Why? Because it's very clear that at one level, that Confederate flag is linked to the slavery of African Americans and a really horrific point in our country. And this is not saying that some of those folks who fought for the Confederacy, all of them were not probably evil. They probably thought they were, doing the right thing. But, we have to be clear on what the symbolism is related to. And as thinking people, as sane people who want a better world, supposedly, we have to let go of those symbols of hatred, of racialism and racism. So, in my view, we should be looking at Columbus in the same way. And there's plenty of reasons to let the imagery go.
There's a lot happening right now in our country that are symptoms of something that happened hundreds of years ago. And we're continually being smacked in the face. We call back to realization, that's people are still upset. And we could put blinders on and say, I don't know. Everybody's great. We're all here. everybody has the same opportunities, do they?
People who try to save his image or really just propping up a false image and a false idea of what the conquest was. And the result of everything that we have around us is a result of those early exploitative days.
They are taking our land right here in Navajo Nation. Just an hour away, people! Help us! The spill just happened! What happened to everybody talking about that? We need help!
It's not just about 500 years ago. That kind of consciousness that we're nurturing for kids, we're wanting them to take those kind of critical questions and to put that lens down on the world today.
In my eyes, the great tragedy of Columbus and subsequent exploration, conquest, and settlement, the greatest tragedy was that they met up with a people who, in many ways, could have been models for a peaceful, vigorous society.
But nevertheless, you know what? We are still here.